The air hung heavy with the humid stillness of a late summer night. Cicadas buzzed their incessant song, a counterpoint to the nervous thump-thump-thump of Ethan's heart. He clutched the spray can, its cold metal a stark contrast to the clammy sweat on his palms. Across the street, Ebenezer Baptist Church stood silhouetted against the inky sky, its steeple a stark, accusing finger pointing at the moon. He hadn't wanted to do this. Not really. But Mark and Jason, those two, they'd been on him all week. About proving himself, about showing he wasn't a scaredy cat, about being one of the guys. They'd whispered about the church, about how it was easy pickings, a target ripe for the taking. They'd laughed, their voices echoing in the darkness of the alleyway where they'd been plotting. Ethan had tried to back out, mumbled something about having to be home early, but their taunts had stung, sharper than any words he could muster. He'd imagined it differently, of course. He'd pictured himself bold, defiant, maybe even a little cool. Instead, a cold knot of dread twisted in his stomach. He felt the familiar tremor in his hands, a symptom of the anxiety that plagued him. He was never brave, never the leader. He was always the follower, the one who tried to blend into the background, hoping to avoid attention. But tonight, he was the center of attention, whether he wanted it or not. He took a shaky breath, the scent of paint fumes stinging his nostrils. He lifted the can, his arm trembling. The spray nozzle felt slick and unfamiliar in his hand. He'd never done anything like this before. He'd never even considered it. He was a good kid, or at least he tried to be. He got decent grades, helped his mom with chores, and generally tried to stay out of trouble. But tonight, all that seemed to melt away, replaced by a chilling sense of wrongness. The words formed in his mind, ugly and hateful, echoing the taunts of his friends. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the nozzle. He could still turn back. He could walk away. He could tell Mark and Jason he'd change his mind. But the thought of their scorn, their laughter, their exclusion, it was a fear that paralyzed him, a fear stronger than his conscience. With a shudder, he squeezed the trigger. The paint hissed from the can, a thin stream of white obscenity blooming across the brick wall of the church. The letters formed slowly, painfully, each one a testament to his cowardice and his betrayal of himself. The silence of the night was broken only by the rasping sound of the spray can and the frantic beating of his heart. He worked quickly, his movements jerky and uncontrolled. The words, crude and hateful, seemed to writhe on the wall as he painted them. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching himself from afar, a horrified spectator to his own actions. He was a ghost, a shadow, a silent accomplice to his own disgrace. The fear wasn't just about getting caught. It was a deeper, more profound fear of himself, of the darkness he was capable of. When he was finished, he stood back, staring at his handiwork. The words, stark and ugly, seemed to mock him. He felt a wave of nausea, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He wanted to erase it all, to scrub the hateful graffiti from the wall, to undo the damage he had done. But he knew it was too late. The deed was done. The damage was irreversible. He dropped the can, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night, a final, desperate act of self-recrimination. He turned and ran, the image of the desecrated church seared into his memory, a constant reminder of his transgression. He ran as if the very air itself were pursuing him, his breath ragged, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He ran until he reached the safety of his own room, where he collapsed onto his bed, the weight of his actions crushing him. The bravado had vanished, replaced by a chilling emptiness, a profound sense of regret that gnawed at his soul. The night, once a canvas for his misguided rebellion, was now a dark testament to his failure. The rising sun cast long shadows across the quiet street, illuminating the dew-kissed lawns and the neatly trimmed hedges. It was a picture-perfect morning, the kind that usually filled Mrs. Henderson with a sense of peace and contentment. But this morning, the tranquility was shattered. As she approached Ebenezer Baptist Church, preparing for her usual morning prayer, her breath caught in her throat. Across the brick wall of the church, stark and ugly, were words scrawled in spray paint. Words that burned with a hateful venom. words that ripped at the fabric of her community, words that violated the sanctity of a place she held dear. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. It wasn't just vandalism. It was a deliberate act of hate, a vicious attack on everything the church represented. Her heart pounded in her chest as she approached the hateful graffiti, the words seared into her mind. A torrent of racial slurs and threats, a vile testament to the ignorance and bigotry that still festered in the world. She felt a wave of nausea, a cold dread washing over her. This wasn't just an attack on the church. It was an attack on her family, on her entire community. Shaking, she reached for her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed Pastor James' number. Her voice trembled as she relayed the news, her words choked with emotion. She could barely speak, the horror of the scene still gripping her. She could only imagine the devastation that would ripple through the congregation, the sense of violation and betrayal that would engulf them. Within minutes, the news spread like wildfire. Word of the vandalism reached the other church members, the community leaders, and the police. Soon, a small crowd gathered outside the church, their faces etched with shock and anger. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into angry outbursts. The sense of outrage was palpable, a collective wave of indignation that threatened to engulf the quiet street. Pastor James arrived shortly after, his face a mask of controlled fury. He surveyed the damage, his eyes scanning the hateful words, his jaw clenched tight. He felt a wave of protectiveness wash over him, a fierce determination to defend his church and his community. He knew this wasn't just an act of vandalism. It was a deliberate attempt to intimidate, to terrorize, to undermine the spirit of a community that had endured generations of struggle and adversity. The police arrived, their presence adding to the growing tension. They took photos, recorded statements, and began their investigation. The officers, too, were visibly shaken by the hateful nature of the crime. They understood the significance of Ebenezer Baptist Church, its historical importance, and the deep emotional impact this act of vandalism would have on the community. As the morning wore on, the anger intensified. People shared stories of similar incidents, acts of hate and discrimination that had plagued their community for far too long. The vandalism of Ebenezer Baptist Church, they realized, wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper, more pervasive problem. It was a stark reminder that despite progress, the fight against prejudice and intolerance was far from over. The outrage fueled a determination to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. But more than that, it fueled a desire to heal, to unite, and to reaffirm the enduring spirit of a community that had faced adversity for generations. The quiet street, once a picture of serenity, was now a crucible of anger, sorrow, and a fierce resolve to overcome. The grainy security footage showed a figure cloaked in shadow, the image flickering intermittently, a ghostly presence against the backdrop of the night. Detective Miller paused the recording, his gaze fixed on the individual's distinctive gait, the way they held their shoulders, the slight limp in their left leg. He'd seen this walk before, somewhere, somehow. It was familiar, yet elusive, a puzzle piece stubbornly refusing to fit into place. He reviewed the footage again, slowing it down, zooming in, enhancing the contrast. The figure was still obscured by darkness, a phantom in the night, but certain details began to emerge. A distinctive baseball cap, a particular style of jacket, a pair of sneakers with a unique pattern. He ran his fingers across his chin, his brow furrowed in concentration. He knew he'd seen that cap, that jacket, those sneakers somewhere before. But where? Then it hit him. A flash of recognition, a jolt of understanding. He'd seen that same baseball cap, that same jacket, those same sneakers just last week at the local convenience store. The young man who'd been buying snacks, the one who'd nervously fumbled with his change, the one who'd had that slight limp in his left leg. He'd dismissed it at the time, a minor detail, nothing significant. But now, the pieces clicked into place. He knew who the vandal was. He pulled up the store's security footage, comparing the two recordings. The match was undeniable. The same gait, the same clothing, the same nervous fidgeting. It was the same young man, the same individual captured on both recordings. He had his suspect. The address was easily obtained. It was a modest house on the outskirts of town, nothing remarkable. But as Detective Miller and his partner approached, a sense of foreboding settled upon them. This wasn't just about catching a vandal. It was about confronting the hateful ideology that had fueled this act of destruction. They found Ethan in his bedroom, hunched over his desk, his face buried in his hands. He looked up as they entered, his eyes wide with fear and regret. He didn't try to run, didn't attempt to deny anything. His guilt was etched on his face, a palpable weight that hung heavy in the air. He knew they were there for him. He'd known it from the moment he saw the news reports, from the moment he saw the images of the vandalized church. The arrest was swift and uneventful. Ethan offered no resistance, his body trembling as he was handcuffed. He didn't speak, didn't offer an explanation. His silence was more eloquent than any confession. The weight of his actions, the enormity of his mistake, seemed to crush him. He was a prisoner of his own guilt, trapped in a cage of his own making. As they drove him to the station, the silence in the back of the police car was deafening. Ethan stared out the window, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, his mind racing. He replayed the events of the previous night, the taunts of his friends, the pressure to conform, the chilling act of vandalism. He felt a profound sense of shame, a crushing weight of remorse that threatened to consume him. He knew he had made a terrible mistake, a mistake that would have far-reaching consequences. The bravado that had fueled his actions was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness, a deep sense of dread that gnawed at his soul. He was no longer the follower. He was the perpetrator, the one responsible for the pain and outrage he had caused. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he would have to face the consequences of his actions. The regret was a heavy cloak, suffocating him, leaving him breathless and utterly alone with the consequences of his choices. The small, sparsely furnished room felt cold and sterile, the air thick with unspoken tension. Ethan sat hunched in a chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the worn linoleum floor. He'd expected anger, a torrent of righteous fury. He'd braced himself for a verbal lashing, a condemnation of his actions. He'd anticipated the wrath of the church community, the scorn of Pastor James. But what he found was something entirely different. Pastor James sat across from him, his demeanor surprisingly calm. There was no fire in his eyes, no visible anger. His expression was one of quiet sadness, a deep well of compassion that seemed to encompass not just Ethan's actions, but the underlying causes of his transgression. He looked not at Ethan as a vandal, but as a lost soul in need of guidance. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against Ethan's already fragile composure. He shifted uneasily in his chair, his eyes darting nervously around the room, avoiding the pastor's gaze. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words caught in his throat, choked by a mixture of shame and fear. Finally, Pastor James spoke, his voice soft but steady, carrying an authority that transcended any outward show of anger. "Ethan," he began, his tone gentle yet firm, "I understand you've been brought here because of what happened at the church." Ethan nodded, a barely perceptible movement. He couldn't meet the pastor's gaze, his shame too profound to allow it. "The words you painted on the wall," Pastor James continued, his voice unwavering, "they were hurtful, hateful, and deeply offensive. They caused pain and distress to many people in this community. They violated a sacred space, a place of worship and peace." Ethan remained silent, his head bowed. He knew he deserved the condemnation, the judgment. He'd expected it, prepared for it. But the pastor's calm demeanor was unsettling, more unnerving than any outburst of rage could have been. "But I also know," Pastor James said, his voice softening further, "that you're a young man, still finding your way in the world. You've made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but mistakes can be corrected. They can be learned from." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. He looked at Ethan, not with condemnation, but with a profound sense of understanding, a recognition of the complexities of human nature. He saw not just the act of vandalism, but the young man behind it, the lost soul struggling with his own demons. "I want to understand what led you to do this," Pastor James continued. "I want to understand the circumstances, the pressures, the influences that brought you to this point." Ethan finally looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and apprehension. He hesitated, unsure of how to respond, unsure of how to explain the tangled web of peer pressure, misguided bravado, and a deep-seated insecurity that had driven him to commit such a hateful act. He opened his mouth to speak, his voice trembling, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He was ready to confess, to explain, to seek forgiveness. The calm demeanor of Pastor James, however, had unexpectedly opened a door to a conversation he hadn't anticipated, a chance for understanding and perhaps even redemption. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time since the act of vandalism, a glimmer of hope flickered within him. Ethan began to speak, his voice trembling at first, then gaining strength as he recounted the events of the previous night, the pressure from his friends, the foolish bravado, the overwhelming sense of inadequacy that had led him to commit the act of vandalism. He spoke of his fear of being ostracized, of his desperate need to belong, of the misguided belief that proving himself to his peers justified his actions. He spoke of his regret, his shame, his profound remorse. Pastor James listened patiently, his expression unwavering, his gaze steady and compassionate. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer judgment. He simply listened, allowing Ethan to pour out his heart, to unburden himself of the weight he had been carrying. When Ethan finished, a long silence hung in the air, broken only by the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, Pastor James leaned forward, his voice softening, his eyes filled with a depth of emotion that surprised Ethan. "Ethan," he began, "I understand what you've said. I understand the pressures you faced, the mistakes you made. But I also want you to know something about myself, something that might help you understand the gravity of your actions, and perhaps help you find a path to redemption." He paused, taking a deep breath. He looked at Ethan, his gaze intense, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of experiences, of battles fought and won, of sacrifices made and lives saved. He began to speak, his voice low and measured, recounting a story that Ethan would never forget. "Many years ago," Pastor James began, "long before I found my calling to the ministry, I served in the military. I was a soldier, deployed to a war-torn country, fighting in a conflict far from home. It was a dangerous time, a brutal war, filled with loss and suffering. I witnessed things no one should ever have to see, things that forever changed my perspective on life and death, on good and evil." He paused again, his eyes distant, as if reliving those memories. He spoke of the horrors of war, the constant threat of death, the camaraderie of his fellow soldiers, the sacrifices they made for one another. He spoke of the courage, the resilience, the unwavering commitment to duty that defined them. Then, he shifted his gaze to Ethan, his voice regaining its strength. "During one particular mission," he continued, "our unit came under heavy fire. We were pinned down, surrounded by the enemy. One of our men, a young soldier, was severely wounded. We were desperate to get him to safety, but the enemy fire was relentless. It was a chaotic scene, filled with fear and uncertainty. I volunteered to go out and retrieve him. It was a dangerous mission, but I knew I had to try." He described the harrowing journey, the intense gunfire, the constant threat of death. He spoke of his determination, his unwavering focus on the wounded soldier, his unwavering commitment to saving a life. He spoke of the adrenaline, the fear, the sheer will to survive that had propelled him forward. "When I finally reached the young soldier," Pastor James said, his voice thick with emotion, "I realized something. It was your grandfather, Ethan. He was severely wounded, but alive. I managed to get him to safety, and he survived. He's the reason I'm here today, the reason I'm able to stand before you and offer you a chance at redemption." The revelation hung in the air, a heavy weight of significance. Ethan sat stunned, his mind reeling from the unexpected connection, the profound impact of the pastor's story. He had to face the church of a man who had saved his grandfather's life. The weight of his actions, the depth of his ignorance, struck him with a force that left him breathless. The path to redemption seemed long and arduous, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose, a chance to make amends for the terrible mistake he had made. A profound silence filled the small room, broken only by Ethan's ragged breathing. The weight of Pastor James' words settled upon him, heavy and suffocating. The revelation hung in the air, a stark and undeniable truth that shattered his preconceived notions, his justifications, his entire worldview. He had defaced the church of the man who had saved his grandfather's life. The enormity of his actions struck him with a force that left him breathless, speechless, utterly overwhelmed. He had painted hateful words on the wall of a building that represented faith, community, and resilience. He had attacked a symbol of hope and perseverance, a place of solace and sanctuary for countless individuals. But now, he understood the personal cost of his actions, the profound connection between his vandalism and the man sitting across from him, a man who had risked his life to save his grandfather's. The shame was a physical entity, a crushing weight on his chest, constricting his breath, making it difficult to swallow. He felt a deep sense of guilt, a profound remorse that gnawed at his soul. His earlier justifications, his attempts to minimize his actions, dissolved into nothingness. There was no excuse, no explanation that could possibly justify what he had done. He pictured his grandfather, a man he loved and respected, a man who had survived a brutal war, a man who had carried the scars of combat, both physical and emotional. He thought of the sacrifices his grandfather had made, the hardships he had endured, the courage he had shown. And he realized that by defacing the church of the man who had saved his grandfather's life, he had not only insulted a community, but he had directly betrayed the legacy of his own family. The images of the graffiti flashed through his mind, the hateful words seared into his memory. He saw them not as mere symbols of rebellion or youthful folly, but as a direct assault on the values his grandfather had fought to protect. He had dishonored his grandfather's sacrifice, his grandfather's legacy, his grandfather's life. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He felt a wave of nausea, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He wanted to disappear, to erase himself from existence, to undo the damage he had caused. But he knew it was too late. The deed was done. The damage was irreversible. He looked at Pastor James, his eyes filled with tears, his voice choked with emotion. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words seemed inadequate, insufficient to express the depth of his remorse. He had betrayed not only the church community, but also the values he claimed to uphold. He had betrayed his own sense of morality, his own conscience. He had betrayed his grandfather. The weight of truth was unbearable, crushing him beneath its immense gravity. He had expected anger, condemnation, punishment. He had braced himself for a verbal lashing, a torrent of righteous fury. But the pastor's calm demeanor, his quiet compassion, had only amplified the depth of his shame. He had not only committed a hateful act, but he had also deeply hurt a man who had shown him unexpected kindness and understanding. The weight of his actions, the weight of his betrayal, was almost too much to bear. He was left alone with his shame, his remorse, and the daunting task of finding a path to redemption. The tears flowed freely now, hot and unrestrained, a torrent of remorse washing over him. He had expected anger, condemnation, punishment. He had braced himself for a verbal lashing, a torrent of righteous fury. But Pastor James' quiet compassion, his unexpected revelation, had shattered his defenses, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and utterly ashamed. The weight of his actions, the depth of his ignorance, the personal connection to his victim, had finally broken through his carefully constructed walls of denial and self-justification. He looked at Pastor James, his eyes filled with tears, his voice choked with emotion. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, to somehow undo the damage he had caused. But the words seemed inadequate, insufficient to express the depth of his remorse. He had betrayed not only the church community, but also the values he claimed to uphold. He had betrayed his own sense of morality, his own conscience. He had betrayed his grandfather. "I'm so sorry," he finally managed to say, his voice barely a whisper. The words caught in his throat, choked by a mixture of shame and regret. I can't explain it. I don't know why I did it. It was stupid, hateful, and wrong. I never should have done it. He paused, struggling to find the words to express the depth of his remorse. The shame was a physical entity, a crushing weight on his chest, constricting his breath, making it difficult to swallow. He felt a deep sense of guilt, a profound remorse that gnawed at his soul. His earlier justifications, his attempts to minimize his actions, dissolved into nothingness. There was no excuse, no explanation that could possibly justify what he had done. He continued, his voice gaining strength, his words pouring forth in a torrent of self-recrimination. He spoke of his misguided bravado, his foolish attempts to impress his friends, his deep-seated insecurity, and his profound ignorance of the pain he had caused. He spoke of the hateful words he had painted on the church wall, the racial slurs, the threats, the utter disrespect he had shown to a place of worship and a community he had come to understand and respect. He spoke of his grandfather, of the sacrifices he had made, of the hardships he had endured, of the courage he had shown. And he realized that by defacing the church of the man who had saved his grandfather's life, he had not only insulted a community, but had directly betrayed the legacy of his own family. The weight of his actions, the depth of his betrayal, was almost too much to bear. I understand if you can't forgive me, he said, his voice trembling. I know what I did was wrong. I know I've hurt a lot of people, but I want to make amends. I want to do whatever I can to make things right. He looked at Pastor James, his eyes pleading for understanding, for forgiveness. He had expected anger, condemnation, punishment. He had braced himself for a verbal lashing, a torrent of righteous fury. But the pastor's calm demeanor, his quiet compassion, had only amplified the depth of his shame. He had not only committed a hateful act, but had also deeply hurt a man who had shown him unexpected kindness and understanding. The weight of his actions, the weight of his betrayal, was almost too much to bear. He was left alone with his shame, his remorse, and the daunting task of finding a path to redemption. But in that moment, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose, a chance to make amends for the terrible mistake he had made. He was ready to begin. Pastor James listened patiently, his gaze unwavering, his expression a mixture of compassion and understanding. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer judgment. He simply listened, allowing Ethan to pour out his heart, to unburden himself of the weight he had been carrying. When Ethan finished, a long silence hung in the air, broken only by the quiet ticking of a clock on the wall. Then, Pastor James leaned forward, his voice soft and measured, his words carrying the weight of history and experience. Ethan, he began, your apology is sincere, and I accept it. But understanding your actions is only the first step. Now, I want to tell you about this church, about its history, and about the community it serves. He began to speak, his voice low and resonant, recounting the story of Ebenezer Baptist Church, its founding, its struggles, its triumphs. He spoke of the generations of African Americans who had worshipped within its walls, who had found solace and strength in its sanctuary, who had fought for their rights and their dignity within its community. He spoke of the church's role in the civil rights movement, its involvement in the fight for equality and justice. He spoke of the sacrifices made, the hardships endured, the unwavering commitment to faith and perseverance that had defined its history. He spoke of the countless individuals who had found hope and healing within its walls, who had overcome adversity and emerged stronger, more resilient, more determined. He described the church's community outreach programs, its support for the needy and the marginalized, its commitment to serving those in need. He spoke of the food bank, the clothing drive, the after-school programs, the countless acts of kindness and compassion that had defined its ministry. He spoke of the church's role in fostering unity and understanding within the community, its commitment to bridging divides and building bridges of hope. He spoke of the church's rich musical heritage, its vibrant gospel choir, its uplifting spirituals, its powerful message of faith and hope. He spoke of the joy and celebration that filled its sanctuary, the sense of community and belonging that bound its members together. He spoke of the church's enduring legacy, its unwavering commitment to faith, hope, and love. He described the significance of the church's architecture, its historical markers, its symbolic representations of faith and perseverance. He spoke of the stained glass windows, the intricate carvings, the powerful imagery that conveyed the church's message of hope and resilience. He spoke of the church's enduring spirit, its ability to withstand adversity, its unwavering commitment to its mission. As Pastor James spoke, Ethan listened intently, his eyes wide with understanding and newfound respect. He had previously seen the church as merely a building, a target for his misguided anger. But now, he saw it as a living entity, a symbol of faith, hope, and resilience, a testament to the enduring spirit of a community that had overcome generations of adversity. He began to understand the profound significance of the place he had so carelessly defaced, the deep emotional impact of his actions. He felt a growing sense of shame, a profound remorse that gnawed at his soul. He had not only committed a hateful act, but he had also deeply hurt a man who had shown him unexpected kindness and understanding. The weight of his actions, the weight of his betrayal, was almost too much to bear. But in that moment, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose, a chance to make amends for the terrible mistake he had made. He was ready to begin. The initial awkwardness was palpable. Ethan, still burdened by the weight of his actions, felt a deep sense of unease as he entered the church for the first time since the incident. He had volunteered to help with cleanup and repairs, a small gesture of atonement, a tentative step towards redemption. He expected judgment, suspicion, perhaps even hostility. Instead, he found something unexpected, a quiet acceptance, a willingness to give him a second chance. Pastor James, true to his word, had spoken to the congregation, explaining Ethan's remorse and his desire to make amends. The community, though still hurt and angered by the vandalism, was willing to offer forgiveness, a testament to their faith and their commitment to compassion. There was a cautious optimism, a willingness to see if Ethan's remorse was genuine, if his desire for redemption was sincere. His first task was simple, sweeping the floor of the sanctuary. The rhythmic motion of the broom, the quiet hum of activity, provided a sense of calm, a welcome distraction from the turmoil within him. He worked diligently, meticulously, pouring his energy into the task, seeking to cleanse not just the floor but also his own soul. He gradually took on more responsibilities, helping with minor repairs, organizing supplies, assisting with the upkeep of the church grounds. He worked alongside other volunteers, many of whom were initially hesitant, their eyes observing him cautiously. But as time passed, as they witnessed his sincere efforts, his unwavering commitment, their skepticism began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of acceptance. He listened attentively as they shared stories about the church, its history, its community. He learned about the challenges they faced, the triumphs they celebrated, the unwavering faith that had sustained them through generations of adversity. He learned about the importance of service, the significance of community, the power of forgiveness. He helped with the church's community outreach programs, assisting at the food bank, participating in the clothing drive, volunteering at the after-school program. He interacted with members of the community, many of whom had been directly affected by his actions. He listened to their stories, their concerns, their hopes. He witnessed their resilience, their strength, their unwavering faith. He saw the church not as a building, but as a living organism, a vibrant community of faith and service. He saw the impact of its ministry, its commitment to helping those in need, its unwavering dedication to its mission. He began to understand the profound significance of the place he had so carelessly defaced, the deep emotional impact of his actions. Slowly, tentatively, he began to earn the trust of the congregation. He wasn't just a vandal who had sought forgiveness. He was a young man who was actively working to make amends, to contribute to the community he had wronged. He was a volunteer, a helper, a member of the church community. He was finding his place, not through bravado or misguided attempts to impress his peers, but through genuine service, sincere remorse, and a steadfast commitment to redemption. The path ahead was still long and challenging, but he was walking it one step at a time, finding his way towards a new purpose, a new sense of belonging, a new life. Ethan's involvement in the church deepened. He wasn't just performing menial tasks anymore. He was actively participating in church activities, learning about the community's history, and engaging with its members on a deeper level. He attended services regularly, listening attentively to the sermons, the hymns, the prayers. He found himself drawn to the stories of faith, resilience, and perseverance that filled the sanctuary. He joined the church choir, his initially hesitant voice blending with the powerful harmonies of the other singers. He discovered a talent he hadn't known he possessed, a gift for music that had been dormant within him. The act of singing, of expressing himself through music, became a form of therapy, a way to channel his emotions, to process his guilt, to find solace and peace. He participated in Bible study groups, engaging in discussions about faith, morality, and social justice. He learned about the struggles faced by African Americans throughout history, the systemic racism they had endured, the injustices they had overcome. He learned about the importance of fighting for equality, for justice, for a better world. He began to understand the profound significance of the church's role in the civil rights movement, its unwavering commitment to social justice, its powerful message of hope and resilience. He volunteered to help with the church's historical preservation project, researching and documenting the church's past. He learned about the individuals who had built the church, the challenges they had faced, the sacrifices they had made. He learned about the church's role in the community, its unwavering commitment to service, its enduring legacy. He discovered stories of courage, resilience, and perseverance that filled him with awe and inspiration. He attended community events, interacting with members of the congregation and the wider community. He listened to their stories, their concerns, their hopes. He learned about their lives, their struggles, their triumphs. He saw the church not as a building, but as a vibrant community of faith, service, and mutual support. He learned about the importance of forgiveness, both for himself and for others. He learned about the power of redemption, the possibility of a second chance. He learned about the significance of making amends, of taking responsibility for his actions, of contributing to the community he had wronged. He discovered a new sense of purpose, a new direction in his life. He was no longer defined by his past mistakes, but by his present actions, his commitment to service, his desire to make a positive impact on the world. He was learning and growing, not just intellectually and spiritually, but emotionally and morally. He was transforming from a young man burdened by guilt and shame into a young man driven by purpose and compassion. The church, once a target of his hatred, had become a source of healing, growth, and transformation. He was finding his place, not through bravado or misguided attempts to impress his peers, but through genuine service, sincere remorse, and a steadfast commitment to redemption. The path ahead was still long and challenging, but he was walking it one step at a time, finding his way towards a new purpose, a new sense of belonging, a new life. The transformation wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was gradual, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was undeniable. Ethan, once an outsider, a pariah, a symbol of hatred, was slowly becoming a member of the church community, a valued contributor, a friend. The initial hesitation, the cautious observation, the lingering suspicion began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of acceptance, a quiet understanding, a genuine appreciation for his sincere efforts at redemption. It started with small gestures, a smile, a nod, a friendly conversation. The volunteers he worked alongside, initially hesitant and reserved, began to treat him with warmth and respect. They shared stories of their lives, their families, their hopes and dreams. They included him in their conversations, their laughter, their fellowship. The members of the congregation, who had initially been shocked and angered by his actions, began to see a change in him. They witnessed his unwavering commitment to service, his genuine remorse, his steadfast dedication to making amends. They saw his participation in church activities, his involvement in community outreach programs, his active engagement in the life of the church. They saw his transformation from a symbol of hatred into a symbol of hope. He found himself invited to church dinners, social gatherings, and community events. He participated in discussions, shared his thoughts and feelings, and listened attentively to others. He formed friendships, bonds of trust and mutual respect. He felt a sense of belonging, a feeling of acceptance he had never experienced before. The children, initially wary of him, began to see him as a friendly face, a helpful hand, a source of laughter and fun. They saw him not as the vandal who had defaced their church, but as a kind and compassionate person who cared about them and their community. They sought him out, shared their stories, and looked to him for guidance and support. The older members of the congregation, who had witnessed generations of struggle and adversity, saw in Ethan a reflection of their own journey, a testament to the power of forgiveness and redemption. They shared their wisdom, their experiences, their unwavering faith. They offered him guidance, support, and encouragement. He was no longer just a volunteer. He was a member of the family. He was included in decisions, consulted on matters of importance, and valued for his contributions. He was no longer an outsider looking in, but an insider, a participant, a contributor. He felt a sense of belonging, a feeling of acceptance he had never experienced before. The church, once a symbol of his hatred and ignorance, had become a source of healing, growth, and transformation. He had found his place, not through bravado or misguided attempts to impress his peers, but through genuine service, sincere remorse, and a steadfast commitment to redemption. The path ahead was still long and challenging, but he was walking it one step at a time, finding his way towards a new purpose, a new sense of belonging, a new life. Ethan's life had undergone a profound transformation. The young man who had once been consumed by anger, insecurity, and a misguided sense of belonging had found a new purpose, a new direction, a new sense of self. He continued his volunteer work at Ebenezer Baptist Church, his efforts becoming increasingly valuable and impactful. He was no longer just helping with minor tasks. He was taking on leadership roles, mentoring younger volunteers, and contributing to the strategic planning of the church's community outreach programs. He became a vital part of the church's historical preservation project, his research skills and meticulous attention to detail proving invaluable. He helped to create a museum exhibit showcasing the church's rich history, its contributions to the civil rights movement, and the struggles and triumphs of its members. He shared his knowledge with visitors, sharing stories of faith, resilience, and perseverance. He continued to participate in the church choir, his voice growing stronger, his confidence increasing. He used his musical talents to uplift and inspire others, sharing his gifts with the community. He organized concerts, fundraisers, and community events, using his newfound skills to benefit the church and the wider community. He mentored at-risk youth, sharing his story of redemption, offering guidance and support. He became a role model for young people, demonstrating the power of forgiveness, the possibility of a second chance, and the importance of making amends. He helped them to find their own paths towards purpose and fulfillment. He continued to engage in discussions about faith, morality, and social justice, sharing his newfound understanding and insights. He became a voice for those who were marginalized and oppressed, advocating for equality, justice, and a better world. He used his experiences to inspire others to fight for what they believe in, to stand up for what is right, to make a positive impact on the world. He had found a sense of belonging, a feeling of acceptance he had never experienced before. He was no longer defined by his past mistakes, but by his present actions, his commitment to service, his desire to make a positive impact on the world. He had transformed from a young man burdened by guilt and shame into a young man driven by purpose and compassion. The vandalism of Ebenezer Baptist Church, once a symbol of his hatred and ignorance, had become a catalyst for his transformation. It had been a turning point, a moment of profound self-reflection, a catalyst for growth and change. He had learned the importance of forgiveness, both for himself and for others. He had discovered the power of redemption, the possibility of a second chance. He had found a new purpose, a new direction in his life. He was no longer just Ethan, the vandal. He was Ethan, a valuable member of the church community, a leader, a mentor, a friend, a beacon of hope. He was living proof that even the most egregious mistakes can be overcome, that even the darkest chapters in life can lead to a brighter future. He had found his place, not through bravado or misguided attempts to impress his peers, but through genuine service, sincere remorse, and a steadfast commitment to redemption. He was walking his path, one step at a time, towards a future filled with purpose, meaning, and a profound sense of belonging.